The initials carved into the fence post were weathered but unmistakable, and Sarah Mitchell traced her fingers over them with a heart that suddenly remembered how to beat faster than it had in 3 long years. The letters read, SM. In careful, deliberate strokes that someone had taken their time creating, and she stood there in the late afternoon sun of September 1883, feeling the Texas heat press against her black morning dress, while something inside her chest cracked open for the first time since they had buried her father. She had come to Redemption Springs to settle his affairs, to sell the mercantile he had owned, to pack up the remnants of a childhood she barely remembered, and then return to her aunt's house in Philadelphia, where everything was proper and cold and safe. But now she stared at these initials, and something wild stirred in her blood. The fence belonged to the Hendersons, whose ranch bordered the eastern edge of town, and Sarah had been walking the perimeter of her father's property when she noticed it. The post stood at the corner where 2 properties met, and the carving was fresh enough that splinters still clung to the grooves. She looked down the fence line and saw another post about 20 yards away. Her feet moved before her mind caught up, and when she reached it, there they were again. SM, carved in the same careful hand, her breath caught. Someone had carved her initials. But who in this dusty Texas town even knew she existed? She had left when she was 15, dragged away by her mother after the divorce, and she had not returned until now, until her father's lawyer had sent the telegram saying he had passed from pneumonia and she was his sole heir. 8 years had passed, and she was a woman of 23 now, educated and refined, with no connection to this place except memories that felt like they belonged to someone else entirely. Yet someone remembered her. Someone had carved her initials into fence posts like a message meant only for her eyes. Sarah gathered her skirts and walked faster, following the fence line. Every post bore the same mark: SM, SM, SM. The repetition was hypnotic, and she lost track of time as she followed them, her heart pounding with each discovery. The fence turned north, following the curve of the land, and she kept walking, kept searching. The sun began to sink lower, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, and still she walked. The fence led her past the Henderson property and onto what looked like open range. She knew she should turn back, that it would be dark soon, that a woman alone on the prairie was asking for trouble, but she could not stop. The initials appeared on every single post, sometimes on the side facing the path, sometimes carved into the top. Whoever had made them had spent hours, days maybe, leaving this trail. Finally, as twilight began to settle, she saw where the fence ended. It ran up to a small homestead tucked into a valley between 2 low hills. A cabin stood there, modest but well-built, with smoke curling from the chimney. A barn sat beside it, and a corral held several horses. The fence she had been following enclosed the entire property, and even from a distance, she could see more posts, more initials. Sarah stopped at the edge of the property, suddenly aware of how improper this was, how strange she must look in her morning dress standing in the middle of nowhere as darkness fell. She should leave. She should go back to town and forget this foolishness. But then the cabin door opened and a man stepped out onto the porch. He was tall and lean, silhouetted against the lamplight from inside, and he stood very still when he saw her. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then he descended the porch steps slowly, walking toward her with a gait that seemed cautious, almost disbelieving. As he came closer, Sarah could make out his features in the fading light. He was young, maybe a year or 2 older than herself, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and eyes that even in the dimness seemed to hold an intensity that made her breath catch. He wore work clothes, dusty and worn, and his hands bore the calluses of a man who worked with them every day. But it was his face that held her attention, the sharp lines of his jaw, the way his mouth parted slightly as if he wanted to speak but could not find the words. "Sarah," he finally said, and his voice was rough with emotion. Sarah Mitchell. She stared at him, searching her memory. There was something familiar about him, something that tugged at the edges of her recollection, but she could not place it. "I apologize," she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "I followed your fence. I saw the initials and I just kept walking. I did not mean to trespass." He shook his head slowly and a smile ghosted across his lips. It was a sad smile, full of old pain and new hope tangled together. "You did not trespass. I built that fence for you. I carved every one of those initials hoping you would see them someday." Sarah felt the world tilt. "I do not understand. Who are you, James?" he said. "James Cooper. We were friends once before you left. I know you probably do not remember." "We were just kids." The name sparked something and Sarah's eyes widened. "Jamie, little Jamie Cooper who used to follow me and Rebecca around," he laughed, and the sound was warm despite the tremor in it. "I was not that little. You were only 2 years older, but yes, that Jamie." Memories flooded back. A skinny boy with dark curls who had lived on the farm next to her father's store, who had tagged along when she and her friend Rebecca had gone exploring, who had looked at her with worshipful eyes when she was 13 and he was 11. She had barely thought of him in years, but now she saw that boy and the man standing before her, saw how he had grown into someone entirely different and yet somehow the same. "You built all of this?" she asked, gesturing at the homestead. "You carved my initials into every fence post." James nodded. "I have been building fences for 4 years now, started when I was 19 and got my own land. I work for the ranchers around here, put up fences for pay, and I started carving your initials into every post I made. I do not know why exactly. Maybe because it felt like keeping a piece of you here, even though you were gone. Maybe because I hoped someday you would come back and see them. People probably think I am crazy." Sarah could not breathe properly. This man, this near stranger who was also somehow the ghost of her childhood, had spent 4 years carving her initials into wood, building a trail that stretched across who knew how many miles of Texas rangeland. It was the most absurd, impractical, romantic thing she had ever heard. "Why?" she whispered. "Why me?" James took another step closer, and in the last light of day she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "Because you were kind to me when no one else was. Because you treated me like I mattered when I was just a poor farm kid with nothing. Because when you left, it felt like the sun went out and I have been trying to find my way back to that light ever since." He paused, swallowing hard. "I know it sounds foolish. You probably have a life back east, probably have someone waiting for you. But when I heard you were back in town, I could not help hoping maybe you would notice. Maybe you would follow the trail." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, and she did not know if they were for the boy he had been, the man he had become, or the girl she used to be who had left without saying goodbye. "I did notice," she said. "I followed every single post. I had to know where they led." "They lead here," James said simply. "They lead home. At least that is what I wanted them to say, that if you ever came back you would have a place to come to, you would know someone had been waiting." The darkness settled fully now and stars began to appear overhead. Sarah knew she should be frightened, alone with a man she barely knew in the middle of nowhere, but she felt safer than she had in years. There was something about James, about the steadiness in his voice and the honesty in his face, that made her want to trust him. "It is getting dark," James said, glancing at the sky. "Let me take you back to town. You can ride one of my horses. It is not safe for you to walk back alone." Sarah nodded, and he led her to the barn where he saddled a gentle mare. He saddled his own horse, a sturdy gelding, and they rode back toward Redemption Springs together. The night was clear and cool, a relief after the heat of the day, and the moon rose bright enough to light their path. They did not speak much on the ride, but the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward, as if they were both processing what had happened, what it might mean. When they reached the edge of town, James slowed his horse. "Where are you staying?" "The hotel above the saloon," Sarah said. "It is the only place in town." He nodded and rode with her to the hotel, helping her dismount. His hands were gentle on her waist, and even through the layers of her dress, she felt the warmth of his touch. "Sarah," he said as she turned to go inside, "could I see you again?" Maybe show you around town, show you how things have changed. She looked at him, this man who had spent years carving her name into wood, and felt something shift in her chest. I would like that. His smile was like sunrise, bright and full of promise. Tomorrow I could come by after breakfast. Tomorrow, she agreed. That night, Sarah lay in her narrow hotel bed and stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. Her mind kept returning to the fence posts, to the patient devotion they represented, to the way James had looked at her as if she were something precious. She had thought she would come to Redemption Springs, settle her father's estate, and leave without looking back. But now everything felt different, complicated in ways that made her heart race. She thought about her life in Philadelphia, the social rounds and tea parties, the young men her aunt paraded before her in hopes of making a good match. None of them had ever made her feel anything beyond polite interest. But James, with his work-roughened hands and his earnest eyes, had awakened something she had not known was sleeping. Morning came too slowly and too quickly at once. Sarah dressed carefully, choosing a simple day dress in dark blue rather than her morning black. She told herself it was because the heat was oppressive, not because she wanted James to see her in something other than funeral clothes. She pinned her honey-colored hair up carefully and studied her reflection. She looked nervous, flushed, younger than she had in months. James arrived exactly when he said he would, clean-shaven and wearing clothes that looked freshly pressed. He had made an effort, and that touched her more than she wanted to admit. He helped her into a small wagon he had borrowed, and they drove through Redemption Springs while he pointed out the changes since she had left. The town had grown. New buildings lined the main street, and the population had swelled with families moving west for opportunity. The mercantile her father had owned was now run by a couple from Missouri, the Hendersons, who had been leasing it since her father became too ill to manage it himself. James explained that her father had been well-liked, that people had respected his fairness and honesty. "He talked about you," James said as they drove past the church. "Especially near the end, he missed you. I think he regretted not fighting harder to keep you here." Sarah felt the familiar ache of grief. My mother would not let him. She was so angry about the divorce, about him choosing to stay in Texas instead of moving to Philadelphia with her. She used me as punishment, I think, kept me away to hurt him. "Did it work?" James asked quietly. "Did she hurt him?" "I think it hurt them both," Sarah said. "It certainly hurt me. I loved my father, but I was 15 and my mother said terrible things about him. It took me years to realize she was lying about most of it, that he was not the villain she made him out to be. By then, I did not know how to reach out to him. And now he is gone, and I will never have the chance to tell him I understand, that I am sorry for believing her." James reached over and took her hand. The gesture was bold, improper, but she did not pull away. His hand was warm and solid, and the calluses on his palm pressed against her skin in a way that felt grounding. "He knew," James said. "I talked to him sometimes when I would come into the store for supplies. He always asked about my fencing work, and I told him about carving the initials. He smiled when I said it, like he thought it was foolish but sweet. I think he hoped you would come back too." Tears spilled down Sarah's cheeks before she could stop them. "I wish I had come sooner." "You are here now," James said. "That matters." They spent the day together, and James showed her the land beyond the town. He took her to the river where they used to play as children, now dammed up to provide water for the growing ranches. He showed her the hills where wildflowers grew in spring, though now in September they were brown and dormant. He pointed out the properties where he had built fences, and Sarah could see her initials everywhere, a constant reminder that she had been in his thoughts all these years. As the afternoon wore on, they stopped by a grove of cottonwood trees for shade and rest. James spread a blanket he had brought, and they sat together eating the lunch he had packed, simple fare of bread and cheese and apples, but it tasted better than any fancy meal Sarah had eaten in Philadelphia. "Tell me about your life back east," James said. "What is it like?" Sarah considered the question. "It is comfortable." My aunt is wealthy and she has given me every advantage. I have an education, I know how to move in society, I have prospects." She paused, realizing how hollow it all sounded when spoken aloud. But it is not real somehow. It is like living in a play where everyone knows their lines and follows the script. Nothing unexpected ever happens, nothing feels alive. "Do you want to go back?" James asked, and she heard the tension in his voice, the fear of what she might answer. "I do not know," Sarah said honestly. 3 days ago I would have said yes without hesitation. This was just a chore to complete, a duty to my father's memory. But now. She looked at him, at the hope and longing in his face. "Now I do not know what I want." "I know what I want," James said. His voice was low, intense. "I want you to stay. I want to court you properly if you will let me. I want to show you that a life here could be good, could be full and real and worth living. I know I do not have much to offer. I'm just a cowboy who builds fences. But I have land and I have plans and I would work every day of my life to make you happy." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. "James, we barely know each other anymore. We are not children playing by the river. This is real life with real consequences." "I know that," he said. He shifted closer and she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the clean scent of soap and sun on his skin. "But some things you just know, Sarah. I knew when I was 11 years old that you were special, that you were someone I wanted in my life. I know it even more now. Give me a chance to prove it to you. Stay for a while, get to know me again. If you decide you want to go back to Philadelphia, I will not stop you. But at least you will be making that choice knowing what you are leaving behind." It was reckless and impulsive, and everything Sarah had been taught not to do. A proper lady did not let a cowboy she barely knew court her. A proper lady went back to civilization and made a sensible match with a respectable man from a good family. But Sarah had followed a trail of carved initials into the wilderness, and she was tired of being proper. "All right," she said. "I will stay for a while, I will give you a chance." The smile that broke across James's face was worth every risk, every breach of propriety. He reached for her hand again, and this time he raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that sent shivers up her arm. "You will not regret it," he promised. "I swear to you, Sarah, you will not regret it." The weeks that followed were the happiest Sarah could remember. James courted her with a dedication that would have been comical if it had not been so sincere. He came to town every day, bringing her small gifts, wildflowers and smooth river stones, and once a carved wooden bird he had made himself. They went on long rides together, always chaperoned by the presence of the open sky and the distant cattle, and he told her about his dreams for his homestead, how he wanted to expand the land, maybe raise horses along with cattle, build a bigger house one day. Sarah told him about Philadelphia, about the libraries and theaters and museums, but also about the loneliness of it, the way she had always felt like an outsider looking in. James listened with an intensity that made her feel heard in a way she never had before. He asked questions, remembered details, cared about the small things that made up her life. The town noticed, of course. Redemption Springs was small enough that nothing escaped scrutiny, and a young woman being courted by James Cooper was prime gossip material. Sarah heard the whispers, saw the speculative looks. Some people were kind, happy to see James settling down with a nice girl. Others were more judgmental, questioning why Sarah Mitchell thought she was too good for the town when she was young, but was happy to come back and take up with a cowboy now. Sarah tried not to let it bother her, but one afternoon when she was at the general store, she overheard 2 women talking loudly enough to make sure she could hear. "She will break his heart," one of them said. "Girls like that always do. She will play at being a cowboy's sweetheart for a while, then run back to her fancy life and leave him broken." "Poor James," the other agreed. "He has worked so hard to build something for himself. He deserves better than someone who will use him and throw him away." Sarah's cheeks burned and she left the store quickly, the items she had meant to purchase forgotten. She walked blindly through town, anger and shame warring in her chest, until she found herself at the livery stable where James was picking up a horse he had left to be shod. He took one look at her face and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" Sarah shook her head, not trusting her voice. James led her around the back of the stable where they could have some privacy, and then he pulled her into his arms. It was the first time he had held her properly, and Sarah let herself lean into his strength, let herself take comfort in the steady beat of his heart. "Tell me," he said softly. So she did. She told him about the women in the store, about their cruel words and the fear that maybe they were right. "What if I do hurt you?" she whispered against his chest. "What if I am not strong enough for this life? What if I realize I cannot give up everything I have known and I have to leave?" James was quiet for a moment, his hand stroking her back in soothing circles. "Then you leave," he said finally. "And yes, it will hurt. It will probably break my heart into 1,000 pieces. But Sarah, I would rather have this time with you, however long it lasts, than spend the rest of my life wondering what might have been. You are worth the risk." She pulled back to look at him, and the sincerity in his eyes made her chest ache. "I do not want to hurt you." "Then do not worry about what might happen," he said. "Just be here now, be honest with me and with yourself. That is all I ask." Sarah nodded and let him hold her a while longer, drawing strength from his certainty. She realized in that moment that she was falling in love with him, truly and deeply, in a way she had never experienced before. It terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. As October arrived and the heat finally began to break, Sarah made a decision. She wrote to her aunt in Philadelphia, explaining that she needed more time to settle her father's affairs and would not be returning as soon as planned. It was not entirely a lie, though the affairs she was settling had more to do with her heart than with property. Her aunt's response came 3 weeks later, full of concern and veiled warnings about propriety and reputation. Sarah read the letter and felt a pang of guilt, but it was distant, abstract. Her aunt's world seemed very far away from the reality of her life in Redemption Springs. James continued to build fences for the surrounding ranches, and whenever he could, Sarah rode out to watch him work. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, the economy of motion as he dug post holes and set rails, the concentration on his face as he carved her initials into each post. He never skipped one, never forgot, and Sarah understood it was more than just a romantic gesture. It was a promise, a testament to his constancy. One afternoon in late October, Sarah sat on a blanket watching James work on a fence for the Kendrick Ranch. The day was beautiful, with a crisp wind and a bright blue sky, and the leaves on the cottonwoods had turned gold. James finished setting a post and walked over to join her, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Tell me something," Sarah said as he sat down beside her. "When did you know? When did you know you had feelings for me that were more than just childhood friendship?" James picked up a blade of grass and twirled it between his fingers, considering. "I think I always knew in some way, but the moment I realized it clearly was the day before you left. You were in your father's store and you were crying because you did not want to go. I wanted to do something, say something to make it better, but I was just a kid and I did not know how. You looked at me and you said, 'Will you remember me, Jamie?' And I promised I would. I promised I would never forget you." Sarah remembered that day, the grief and anger that had consumed her, the feeling of her world ending. She barely remembered talking to James, but now the memory surfaced, his young face serious and determined as he made his promise. "You kept that promise," she said softly. "I did." "And about 2 years later, when I was 13, I was helping my father fix a fence, and I just started carving your initials into the post. He asked me why, and I could not explain it except to say it felt right. It felt like keeping you close somehow. When I got my own land and started working as a fence builder, it just became habit. Every post, every fence, your initials. People asked me about it sometimes, and I just said it was my mark, like a signature, but I knew the truth. I was leaving you a trail, hoping someday you would follow it home." "Home," Sarah repeated. She looked around at the wide expanse of prairie, the distant hills, the endless sky. It was so different from Philadelphia, from the narrow streets and brick buildings. But it felt right in a way Philadelphia never had. "I think this might be home," she said, surprising herself. "I think it might have always been home and I just did not realize it." James set down the grass and turned to face her fully. His expression was serious, almost solemn. "Sarah, I need to know. I need to know if this is real for you, if I am real for you, or if I am just an escape from a life you do not want. Because if it is just escape, if you are with me because I am different and exciting and not because you actually care about me, then I need you to tell me now before I fall any deeper." Sarah reached for his hand, lacing her fingers through his. They fit together perfectly, her small hand in his larger, work-roughened one. "James, you are the most real thing in my life. When I am with you, I feel like myself in a way I never have before. You see me, not the image of what I should be or what people expect, but actually me. And I see you, this good, honest, hard-working man who has somehow decided I am worth waiting for. I do not know what the future holds, but I know that what I feel for you is real. It is the most real thing I have ever felt." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away, but she did not. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle at first, tentative, and then deeper as years of longing poured into it. Sarah had been kissed before, chased pecks from suitable young men at proper social functions, but this was different. This was fire and home and rightness all tangled together. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, James rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "I have loved you for so long I do not remember not loving you." "I love you too," Sarah whispered, and saying the words out loud made them real in a way that terrified and thrilled her. "I love you, James Cooper." They sat there together as the sun moved across the sky, holding each other and talking about everything and nothing. They talked about what a life together might look like, the challenges they would face, the questions people would ask. James made it clear he would not trap her, that she was free to choose her own path, but his hope was naked on his face every time he looked at her. As November arrived and the weather turned colder, Sarah began making arrangements to stay in Redemption Springs permanently. She wrote to her aunt explaining her decision, and the response was explosive. Her aunt wrote back in fury, calling her foolish and ungrateful, saying she was throwing away every opportunity for a man who could offer her nothing but hardship and poverty. She demanded Sarah return immediately and threatened to cut her off completely if she refused. Sarah read the letter in the privacy of her hotel room and felt a strange calmness settle over her. Her aunt's anger could not touch her here, could not change her mind. She wrote back a careful, respectful response explaining that her decision was final, that she appreciated everything her aunt had done for her, but that her life was in Texas now. She did not expect her aunt to understand, but she hoped someday they might reconcile. The townspeople gradually warmed to the idea of Sarah and James together. Seeing them side by side, seeing the obvious love and respect between them, most people let go of their skepticism. The women who had gossiped in the store even apologized to Sarah one day, admitting they had been hasty in their judgment and wishing her happiness. James began building an addition to his cabin, preparing for the day when Sarah might live there with him. He worked on it in the evenings and on Sundays, and Sarah often came to help, handing him tools and holding boards in place while he nailed them. They worked well together, falling into an easy rhythm that felt natural and right. In early December, on a cold, clear morning, James came to town and found Sarah having breakfast at the hotel restaurant. He looked nervous, and his hands shook slightly when he sat down across from her. "There is something I need to ask you," he said. "I know we have not been courting that long, not in the official sense, but Sarah, I have been waiting for you for 8 years. I do not want to wait anymore." Sarah's heart began to pound. She knew what was coming, had been half expecting it, but actually hearing it was different. James reached into his pocket and pulled out a ring. It was simple, a thin gold band with a small blue stone set in it. "This was my grandmother's," he said. "It is the only valuable thing I own. Sarah Mitchell, will you marry me? Will you be my wife and build a life with me here in Redemption Springs?" Sarah looked at the ring, then at James, at the love and vulnerability in his eyes. This was the moment. This was the decision that would define the rest of her life. She could say yes and commit to a future that was uncertain and hard but full of love, or she could say no and return to Philadelphia to comfort and security and emptiness. "Yes," she said, and the word came out strong and sure. "Yes, James, I will marry you." The relief and joy on his face were beautiful to see. He slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit as if it had been made for her. They held hands across the table, grinning at each other like fools until the proprietor of the hotel came over and demanded to know what all the fuss was about. When James announced they were engaged, the woman let out a whoop and called to everyone in the restaurant that there was going to be a wedding. The news spread through Redemption Springs like wildfire, and by afternoon, half the town had stopped by to offer congratulations. The preacher, a kindly man named Reverend Thorne, offered to marry them at the church whenever they were ready. The ladies of the town began planning, talking about dresses and flowers and food for a celebration. Sarah and James decided to marry quickly, not wanting to wait through the winter. They set the date for the last Saturday before Christmas, giving them 3 weeks to prepare. It was not much time, but neither of them cared about having a grand affair. They just wanted to be married, to start their life together officially. Those 3 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Sarah worked with the seamstress in town to alter a dress that had belonged to the woman's daughter, a simple but beautiful gown of ivory silk. James finished the addition to the cabin and bought furniture, a proper bed and a table and chairs, everything they would need to start their household. He also commissioned a special wedding present, though he refused to tell Sarah what it was. The morning of the wedding dawned cold and bright, with frost sparkling on the ground. Sarah woke early in her hotel room, her stomach fluttering with nerves and excitement. The women of the town came to help her dress, fussing over her hair and the fit of her gown, offering advice and well wishes. When Sarah finally looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman looking back. She looked happy, radiant, so different from the grief-stricken girl who had arrived in Redemption Springs just a few months ago. The dress fit perfectly, and someone had found a wreath of winter greenery for her hair. She wore her grandmother's pearl earrings, the only jewelry she had brought from Philadelphia, and James's ring gleamed on her finger. The church was packed when she arrived. It seemed like the entire town had turned out for the wedding, crammed into the pews and standing along the walls. Candles lit the interior, casting a warm glow, and someone had decorated with pine branches that filled the air with their fresh scent. Sarah walked down the aisle alone, having no one to give her away, but she held her head high and her eyes found James standing at the front. He looked stunned, as if he could not quite believe she was real and walking toward him. He wore new clothes, a white shirt and dark pants, and his hair was neatly combed. But it was his expression that stole her breath, the naked adoration and wonder on his face. She saw the boy she had known in the man he had become, and she saw their future together stretching out like an unmarked trail waiting to be traveled. Reverend Thorne performed the ceremony with warmth and humor, speaking about love and commitment and the sanctity of marriage. When it came time for the vows, James's voice was steady and sure, and Sarah's rang out clear and true. They promised to love and honor each other, to stand together through whatever came, and when the Reverend pronounced them husband and wife, James kissed her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with tears. The celebration afterward was held at the town hall, with tables laden with food that the community had contributed. There was music and dancing, and Sarah found herself whirled from partner to partner, everyone wanting to wish the newlyweds well. But her eyes kept finding James across the room, and every time their gazes met, she felt a jolt of happiness so intense it was almost painful. As evening fell and the party began to wind down, James pulled her aside. I have something to show you, he said, his eyes sparkling with mischief and excitement. Your wedding present. He led her outside where his wagon waited, and they drove through the cold night toward his homestead, their homestead now. Sarah leaned against his shoulder, warm under the blankets he had piled over them, watching the stars wheel overhead. Everything felt perfect, crystalline and clear, like a dream she was afraid to wake from. When they arrived at the cabin, James helped her down from the wagon and then covered her eyes with his hands. No peeking, he said, guiding her forward carefully. She heard the cabin door open and felt the warmth from the fire he had left burning. He led her inside and positioned her carefully, then dropped his hands. All right, look. Sarah opened her eyes and gasped. One entire wall of the cabin had been transformed. James had built a massive wooden panel that stretched from floor to ceiling, and carved into it in intricate, beautiful detail were her initials. But these were not the simple SM from the fence posts. These initials were works of art, surrounded by flowers and vines and birds, all carved with painstaking care. And woven through the design were words carved in script. Sarah Mitchell Cooper, you are my home, my heart, my every fence post made whole. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she moved closer, tracing the carvings with trembling fingers. The work that had gone into this, the hours and skill and love were overwhelming. James, she breathed, this is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen. He came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his chin on her shoulder. I wanted you to know, he said softly. Every fence I build, every post I carve, it is all for you. It has always been for you, but this one is special. This one is in our home, where you will see it every day and remember that you are loved. Sarah turned in his arms and kissed him, pouring everything she felt into it, all the love and gratitude and joy that words could not contain. This was her husband, her partner, the man who had spent years carving her name into wood and hoping she would find her way home. And she had. Against all odds and expectations, she had followed the trail and found exactly where she belonged. Their wedding night was tender and sweet, full of nervous laughter and gentle discoveries. They learned each other in the firelight, and Sarah felt more alive than she ever had, every nerve singing with sensation and emotion. James was patient and careful, making sure she felt safe and cherished, and when they finally came together fully, it felt like a completion, two halves becoming whole. Afterward, they lay tangled together in their marriage bed, and Sarah traced the muscles of James's chest idly, feeling his heart beat strong and steady beneath her palm. Tell me about the fences, she said. Tell me about all the places my initials are carved. So James did. He told her about the Hendersons' ranch where she had first found the initials, about the Kendrick property and the Morrison homestead. He told her about the fence that ran along the river, marking the boundary between two properties, and how he had carved extra carefully on those posts because he thought they were beautiful and hoped she would see them. He told her about the fence for the schoolhouse, where children would see her initials and wonder about them, and the fence around the church cemetery, where the dead rested under the watch of her carved name. There are miles of them, he said, maybe hundreds of posts, I lost count. But every single one was a prayer in a way, a hope that you would come back, that you would see them, that you would know someone was waiting for you. How many people asked you about them? Sarah wondered. James chuckled. More than a few. Most folks just thought it was my signature, like I said. A few figured it out, guessed that I was sweet on someone whose initials were SM. Old Mrs. Henderson asked me outright once if I was pining for a lost love, and I told her I was pining for a love I hoped to find again. She thought that was very romantic. It is romantic, Sarah said. It is the most romantic thing I have ever heard. You built me a trail home, James. You spent years building it, not knowing if I would ever follow it. But you did, he said, pulling her closer. You followed it all the way here to me, and now you are mine and I am yours, and I am the luckiest man in Texas. Sarah smiled against his chest, breathing in the scent of him, wood smoke and leather and something uniquely James. I am the lucky one. I could have stayed in Philadelphia and married some boring banker and never known what this felt like. Instead, I followed my initials carved in fence posts and found love. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, and Sarah's last conscious thought was that she was home, truly home, in a way she had never been before. The winter passed in a haze of happiness. Sarah settled into life as a rancher's wife, learning the rhythms of the homestead, the daily chores and routines. It was hard work, harder than anything she had done in Philadelphia, but it was satisfying in a way that needlepoint and social calls had never been. She learned to cook over the wood stove, to care for the chickens and the horses, to mend and sew and preserve. James taught her to ride properly, not the sedate side-saddle trotting she had done back east, but real riding. And she discovered she loved the freedom of it, the wind in her hair and the power of the horse beneath her. James continued building fences through the winter when weather permitted, and Sarah often rode out to bring him lunch and keep him company. She never tired of watching him carve her initials, of seeing the care he took with each one. Sometimes she helped, holding posts steady or handing him tools, and they worked in comfortable silence, the kind that came from deep understanding. In February, Sarah realized she was pregnant. The signs were unmistakable, though it took her a few weeks to work up the courage to tell James. When she finally did, over dinner one evening, his reaction was everything she could have hoped for. He leapt up from the table and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while laughing, and then very carefully set her down as if she were made of glass. "We are having a baby," he said, wonder in his voice. "Sarah, we are having a baby." "We are," she confirmed, laughing at his mixture of excitement and terror. "In late summer, I think, maybe September." James knelt down and pressed his ear to her still flat stomach, as if he could hear the baby growing inside. "Hello in there," he said softly. "This is your papa. I am very excited to meet you." He looked up at Sarah and his eyes were wet. "Thank you," he said. "Thank you for this, for choosing this life, for giving me everything I never dared to hope for." Sarah ran her fingers through his hair, her own eyes stinging. "Thank you for waiting. Thank you for building me a trail home." As spring arrived and the prairie burst into bloom, Sarah's belly began to round. She felt the baby move for the first time in April, a flutter like butterfly wings, and she grabbed James's hand and pressed it to her stomach so he could feel it too. His face when he felt that tiny movement was transcendent, full of awe and love. The townspeople rallied around them, the women especially. They brought baby clothes and blankets, offered advice and assistance, planned a celebration for after the birth. Sarah, who had spent so much of her life feeling like an outsider, was overwhelmed by the acceptance and community. These people had become her family, and Redemption Springs truly was her home. James finished a major fencing project in June, a huge undertaking for a rancher named Caldwell who wanted to fence several hundred acres of prime grazing land. It was the biggest job James had ever taken, and it kept him busy for weeks. But every single post bore Sarah's initials, carved with the same care as always. When Caldwell asked him about it, James just smiled and said it was his signature, but Caldwell winked and said he had heard about the romantic cowboy who carved his wife's initials into every fence he built, and he thought it was a fine tradition. In late August, Sarah's pains began. It was evening, and she and James had just finished dinner when the first contraction hit. James went pale and rushed to get the midwife, a capable woman named Mrs. Yates, who had delivered half the babies in Redemption Springs. Mrs. Yates arrived quickly and took charge, shooing James out of the bedroom and telling him to boil water and stay out of the way. The labor was long and hard, lasting through the night and into the next day. James paced outside, wearing a path in the dirt, jumping every time Sarah cried out. Other women arrived to help, friends who had become like sisters to Sarah, and they went in and out of the bedroom with purposeful efficiency. Finally, as afternoon sun slanted through the windows, James heard the sound he had been waiting for, the thin, angry wail of a newborn baby, Mrs. Yates emerged from the bedroom, tired but smiling. "You have a son, Mr. Cooper, a healthy, strong boy with a good set of lungs." James pushed past her into the bedroom where Sarah lay propped up on pillows, exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he had ever seen her. In her arms was a tiny bundle, and when she pulled back the blanket, James saw his son for the first time. The baby had dark hair like his and a red, scrunched face that was already smoothing out as he calmed. His eyes were closed, but his tiny fist waved in the air as if reaching for something. "James," Sarah said, her voice hoarse from hours of labor, "come meet your son." James approached slowly, reverently, and when Sarah placed the baby in his arms, he felt his heart expand in a way he had not known was possible. This was his child, his son, a piece of him and Sarah made flesh. The baby's weight was almost nothing, but the responsibility of it, the trust, was overwhelming. "What should we name him?" Sarah asked. James looked down at the tiny face, then at Sarah. "What about David? It was my father's name," Sarah smiled. "David Cooper, I like it, David James Cooper." "David James," James repeated, testing it out. The baby made a small sound and James laughed through his tears. "Hello, David. Welcome to the world, son." The weeks after David's birth were exhausting but joyful. The baby cried often, needing to be fed and changed and comforted, and neither Sarah nor James got much sleep. But every time James held his son, every time he watched Sarah nurse him with infinite patience, he felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. This was his family. This was the life he had built, the life he had hoped for during all those years of carving initials into fence posts. When David was 6 weeks old, James took Sarah and the baby out to see a fence he had just completed. It was for a new settler, a family from Ohio who had bought land just south of town. James had carved Sarah's initials into every post as usual, but on the final post, the one nearest the road where everyone would see it, he had carved something different. Sarah read it aloud, her voice catching. "SMC and DJC, my heart, my home, my everything." She looked at James with tears streaming down her face. "You added David." "Of course I did," James said, bouncing the baby gently. "He is part of our story now. Every fence I build from here on out will have both your initials." "You are both my everything." Sarah kissed him there beside the fence with their son between them and the wide Texas sky overhead. "I love you," she said. "I love this life we are building together." "I love you too," James said. "I will never stop loving you. I will never stop carving your initials, marking the world with proof that you are mine and I am yours." The years rolled on, full and good. David grew from a baby into a toddler, then a boy, curious and energetic and showing signs of his father's patient determination. When he was 3, Sarah became pregnant again, and this time they had a daughter they named Emma Rose. She had Sarah's honey-colored hair and James's dark eyes, and she was as sweet and gentle as her brother was wild and adventurous. James's fencing business thrived, and he became known throughout the region not just for the quality of his work but for the romantic tradition of carving initials. Other young men started copying him, carving their sweetheart's initials into their own work, and James always smiled when he saw it. He had started a tradition, a way of marking love and commitment that was spreading. He built another addition onto the cabin when Emma was born, making room for their growing family. He also built a workshop where he could do more detailed carving work, creating furniture and decorative pieces during the winter when fencing was impossible. He made a cradle for Emma that was covered in delicate carvings, flowers and birds and her initials woven into the design. He made a rocking horse for David with the same care, and the children treasured these gifts from their father. Sarah became a pillar of the community, involved in the church and the school, always ready to help a neighbor in need. She thought sometimes of her life in Philadelphia, of what might have been if she had not followed those carved initials, and she could not imagine it. That life felt like it had belonged to someone else, a different Sarah who had not known what real love and purpose felt like. When David was 7 and Emma was 4, Sarah discovered she was pregnant a third time. This pregnancy was harder than the first two, and Sarah was sick and tired for much of it. James worried constantly, hovering and fussing until Sarah had to gently tell him to go build a fence before she screamed. He did, but he came home every day at noon to check on her, and he did as much of the housework as he could to spare her. Their third child was born in the spring, another boy they named Thomas after Sarah's father. He was small and quiet, so different from boisterous David and sweet Emma, but perfect in his own way. James held him and whispered the same words he had said to David and Emma when they were born, welcoming him to the world and promising to love him always. The homestead grew as the family grew. James bought more land, expanded the house again, built a proper barn and new corrals. He started raising horses along with cattle, discovering he had a gift for training them. David was fascinated by the horses and spent hours watching his father work, learning the patience and skill required. Emma preferred the garden Sarah had cultivated, helping her mother grow vegetables and flowers, her small hands gentle with the plants. Thomas, as he grew, showed an interest in carving like his father. James taught him carefully, starting with soft wood and simple designs, guiding his son's hands and praising his efforts. They worked together in the workshop on winter evenings, the sound of their knives against wood a soothing rhythm. When David was 12, he asked his father about the initials. They were riding the fence line together, checking for damage after a storm, and David had noticed the carvings on every post. "Papa, why do you carve Mama's initials into everything?" he asked. James reined in his horse and looked at his son, this almost man who had his mother's eyes and his grandfather's thoughtful nature. "It is a promise," he said, "a reminder that love is not just words, it is actions. Your mama came back to Texas not knowing if she belonged here, and I wanted to show her that she did. Every initial I carved was a piece of a trail leading her home to me. And now, every initial I carve is a promise to keep loving her, to keep building our life together, to never take for granted what we have." David absorbed this solemnly. "That is very romantic, Papa," James laughed. "Your mama thinks so, and someday when you fall in love, you will understand. Love is not just a feeling, son. It is a choice you make every day, and it is work, good work, the best work there is. These initials are my way of choosing your mama every single day." "I want to be like you when I grow up," David said. "I want to love someone the way you love Mama." James reached over and squeezed his son's shoulder. "You will, David. You have a good heart. You will find your own way to show love, and it will be right for you and whoever you choose." The family attended church every Sunday, and Sarah taught the children to read and write, supplementing what they learned at the small schoolhouse in town. She read to them every night, stories of adventure and romance, and James would sit in his chair by the fire, carving or mending tack, listening to his wife's voice and his children's laughter, and feeling more blessed than any man had a right to be. When Emma was 10, she asked her mother about Philadelphia, about the life Sarah had left behind. They were sewing together, making a new dress for Emma, and the question surprised Sarah. "Why did you leave your aunt and all that fancy life to stay here with Papa?" Emma asked. "Were you not scared?" Sarah set down her needle and looked at her daughter, this beautiful girl who was so much herself and yet entirely her own person. "I was terrified," she admitted. "I had known nothing but cities and society, and suddenly I was choosing a life on the frontier with a man I had barely known. But Emma, sometimes the scariest choice is the right one. Your father made me feel alive in a way I never had before. He saw me, really saw me, and he loved me for who I was, not who people expected me to be. That is a gift beyond price." "Do you ever miss it?" Emma asked. "The city and the fancy things?" "Sometimes," Sarah said honestly. "Sometimes I miss the theater and the libraries, but I would not trade this life for anything. I have your father and you children and this community. I have purpose and meaning and love." What do fancy things matter compared to that? Emma smiled and hugged her mother. I am glad you stayed. I am glad you chose Papa and chose us. So am I, sweetheart, so am I. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes and challenges. There were droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that killed livestock, illnesses that swept through the community. But through it all, Sarah and James held together, their love the bedrock on which everything else was built. They weathered each storm and celebrated each triumph, and their children grew strong and capable under their care. David fell in love at 18 with a rancher's daughter named Catherine, and James taught him about courting, about respect and patience. David did not carve initials into fences, but he wrote Catherine poems and brought her flowers, and when he asked her to marry him, she said yes without hesitation. Their wedding was held at the same church where James and Sarah had married, and Sarah cried watching her son take his vows, remembering her own wedding day and how young and hopeful they had been. Emma grew into a beautiful, kind young woman who wanted to be a teacher. She studied hard and passed the examination, and at 19, she began teaching at the Redemption Springs schoolhouse. She was beloved by her students, patient and creative, and Sarah was so proud she thought her heart might burst. Emma eventually married a doctor who came to town, a good man named Michael who adored her completely, and they had 4 children together who called Sarah and James Grandma and Grandpa, and filled the homestead with even more love and noise. Thomas, Quiet Thomas, discovered he had a gift for carving that surpassed even his father's. He created beautiful pieces, functional and artistic, and people came from miles around to commission work from him. He built a reputation as a craftsman, and eventually he opened a shop in town where he sold furniture and decorative items. He married late, at 26, to a widow with 2 young children, and he loved them as if they were his own blood. Sarah and James grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies moving more slowly. But their love never diminished. If anything, it deepened, becoming richer and more complex with each passing year. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other good morning and good night, still looked at each other with the same wonder they had felt as newlyweds. On their 25th wedding anniversary, James took Sarah out to a fence he had just repaired on their property. The posts were old, some of the original ones he had built when they first married, and the initials were worn and faded. But James had carved new ones beside them, fresh and clear, and beneath them he had carved words. 25 years of loving Sarah Mitchell Cooper, and I would do it all again, Sarah read aloud. She turned to her husband with tears in her eyes. James, after all these years, you are still carving my initials. I will never stop, he said, pulling her close. As long as I have breath in my body and strength in my hands, I will carve your initials. You are my great love, Sarah. You are my everything. Following those fence posts home was the best thing you ever did, and waiting for you to find them was the best thing I ever did. Sarah kissed him there in the sunshine, surrounded by the land they had built together, the fences that bore witness to their love. I love you, James Cooper. I will love you until my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Sarah Cooper, forever and always. They stood there together, 2 people who had found each other against the odds, who had built a life and a family and a legacy of love. Around them stretched the fences James had built, miles and miles of them, each post carved with initials that told the story of a cowboy who had loved a girl enough to leave her a trail home, and a woman who had been brave enough to follow it. Their children and grandchildren would carry on that legacy, would tell the story of James and Sarah Cooper and the fence posts that brought them together. It would become legend in Redemption Springs, passed down through generations, a reminder that true love was patient and persistent, that it could span years and distance, that it was worth every risk and every sacrifice. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew across the prairie and the stars came out, you could walk the fence lines around Redemption Springs and see the initials, faded but still visible, marking the landscape with a promise kept, and a love that endured. SMC, carved into wood and carved into history, a testament to a cowboy who knew how to build more than fences, who knew how to build a home, a family, and a love story for the ages. Years later, when Sarah was 70 and James 72, they sat together on the porch of their homestead, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. Their children had grown and moved into their own homes, though they visited often. The grandchildren, now numbering 14, ran wild across the property during summers, learning to ride and rope and tend the land. There were even great-grandchildren now, babies who would carry the Cooper name into a new century. James held Sarah's hand, his grip still strong despite the arthritis that plagued his fingers. His body had aged, but his eyes were the same, still looking at her with that mixture of love and wonder that made her feel young again. "You remember the day you followed the fence posts?" James asked, his voice rougher with age but still warm. "Every detail," Sarah said, smiling at the memory. "I thought I was going mad following initials carved into wood, but something pulled me forward, something I could not resist." "Fate," James said. "It was fate, Sarah. We were always meant to find each other again." "Perhaps," Sarah agreed. "Or perhaps it was a cowboy who was foolish and romantic enough to spend years carving a trail, hoping a girl would follow it home." James chuckled. "I prefer to think it was both, fate and foolishness working together." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The land stretched out before them, fences crisscrossing the prairie like a map of their life together. Every post told part of their story, every initial a chapter in their love. No regrets. James asked, as he had asked her countless times over the years. "Not a single one," Sarah answered, as she always did. "You? Only that I did not tell you I loved you sooner, that I wasted even a day not making sure you knew how I felt." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You told me in the way that mattered most. You carved it into wood, built it into fences, made it permanent and real. I saw it, James. I saw your love in every initial, and I followed it home." They watched the stars emerge one by one until the sky was full of them. David arrived with Catherine and their children for dinner, and Emma and Michael came too with their brood. Thomas brought his wife and stepchildren, now teenagers who thought their step-grandfather was the coolest person alive because he could carve anything. The house filled with noise and laughter. 3 generations gathered around the table James had built 40 years ago, eating food Sarah had prepared with Emma and Catherine's help. After dinner, the youngest grandchild, a boy of 5 named Samuel, climbed into James's lap. "Grandpa, tell us the story again," he demanded. "Tell us about the fence posts and Grandma following them." James looked at Sarah, who smiled and nodded. He had told this story 100 times, maybe 1,000, but he never tired of it. So he began again, telling his grandchildren about a girl who left Texas and a boy who never forgot her, about years of waiting and hoping, about initials carved into every fence post like a trail of breadcrumbs leading home. The children listened, riveted as always, and when he finished, little Samuel said, "That is the best story ever, Grandpa. When I grow up, I am going to carve something for someone I love too." "That is a fine plan," James said, ruffling the boy's hair. "Just make sure it comes from the heart and that it is something true. That is what matters most." Later, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet again, Sarah and James climbed the stairs to their bedroom. James's knees ached, and Sarah moved more slowly than she once had, but they made it together, supporting each other as they always had. They prepared for bed with the ease of long practice, and when they finally lay down together, James pulled Sarah close, her back against his chest, his arm around her waist. "I love you, Sarah Cooper," he whispered into her hair. "I have loved you since I was 11 years old, and I will love you forever." "I love you too, James Cooper," Sarah whispered back. "Thank you for building me a trail home. Thank you for this beautiful life." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, 2 hearts beating in time. And if you had been able to look into their dreams, you would have seen a young cowboy carving initials into a fence post, and a young woman in a black dress following them through the Texas heat, moving toward a future neither could have imagined but both had hoped for. You would have seen love in its purest form, patient and persistent, built one fence post at a time, carved into the very landscape and into two hearts that had found their way to each other and never let go. The next morning, James woke before dawn as he always had. He dressed quietly, careful not to wake Sarah, and went outside to watch the sunrise. It was a ritual he had kept for decades, this quiet time alone with the land he loved and the life he had built. But this morning felt different somehow, more precious, as if the universe was reminding him to pay attention, to be grateful. Sarah joined him as the sun broke over the horizon, bringing him coffee the way he liked it and settling into her own chair beside him. They did not speak, just sat together watching the light spread across the prairie, turning everything gold. This was enough. This had always been enough. In the months that followed, James slowed down more. He still worked, still built and repaired fences, but he could not do as much as he once had. David took over more of the physical labor, and Thomas helped too when he could spare time from his shop. James spent more time with Sarah, taking walks around the property, visiting with grandchildren, telling stories. On a crisp October day, James and Sarah walked the fence line together, something they had done countless times but never tired of. James stopped at each post, running his hand over the carved initials, some of which he had made 50 years ago. Sarah walked beside him, remembering the day she had first seen them, the way her heart had raced, the certainty that had pulled her forward. "We have had a good life," James said, stopping at a post that marked the corner of their original property. "Better than I ever dreamed possible." "We have," Sarah agreed. "We have been blessed beyond measure." James pulled her close and kissed her forehead. "If I had it all to do over again, I would not change a thing. Except maybe I would have carved your initials even bigger, made them impossible to miss, just to make sure you found your way home even faster." Sarah laughed. "They were perfect just as they were. Everything was perfect, James." Everything? As winter approached, James caught a cold that settled in his chest. Sarah nursed him carefully, making him rest and eat, calling the doctor when his breathing became labored. The doctor did what he could, but pneumonia had set in, and at James's age, there was little to be done but keep him comfortable. James was lucid and calm, accepting what was coming with the same steady grace he had shown throughout his life. His children gathered and his grandchildren, and they took turns sitting with him, holding his hand, telling him they loved him. But it was Sarah who never left his side, Sarah who held his hand through the long nights, Sarah who whispered memories and love into his ear. On a quiet December morning, with snow falling softly outside and Sarah lying beside him in their bed, James opened his eyes and looked at his wife. He saw her as she had been at 23, walking toward him in her mourning dress, and as she was now at 70, her face lined but still beautiful, her eyes still bright with love. "Sarah," he whispered. "My Sarah, you followed the trail home." "I did," she said, tears streaming down her face. "And I have never regretted it for a moment." "I love you," he said. "I will always love you. Find me in the next life, and I will carve your initials into the stars so you can find your way to me again." "I will find you," Sarah promised. "I will always find you." James smiled, and then his eyes closed and his breathing slowed, and then stopped. Sarah held him as his spirit left, feeling the exact moment when he was no longer there, when all that remained was the shell of the man she had loved for nearly half a century. She lay there with him for a long time, remembering everything, grieving everything, but also feeling a strange peace. They had loved each other well. They had built something beautiful together, and that could never be taken away. The funeral was enormous, people coming from all over the county to pay their respects. James Cooper had been beloved, known for his honesty and skill and kindness. But more than that, he had been known for his love story, for the fence posts that had brought him and Sarah together. People spoke of it at the service, how James had never stopped carving those initials, how his love for Sarah had been a constant, visible thing that had inspired them all. Sarah stood at his grave with her children beside her, and she felt the weight of loss pressing down on her. But she also felt James's presence, his love surrounding her like a warm blanket. He was gone, but he was also still here, in the land they had tended together, in the children and grandchildren they had raised, in every fence post that bore witness to their love. The months after James's death were hard. Sarah had never lived without him, and the house felt empty despite frequent visits from her children. But she kept going, kept living, because that was what James would have wanted. She tended the garden and visited the grandchildren and told stories about their grandfather, keeping his memory alive. One spring morning, a year after James had passed, Sarah took a walk along the fence line. The posts were weathered now, many of them needing repair, but the initials were still visible. She traced them with her fingers, feeling close to James in a way she had not since he died. And then she noticed something that made her breath catch. On one of the newer posts there were fresh carvings. Beneath her initials someone had carved words. For Sarah, who followed the trail. For James, who built it. May your love live forever. Sarah looked around and saw David watching her from a distance. He walked over, and Sarah saw he held a carving knife. I thought it was time to add to the story, he said. To make sure people remember not just what Papa built, but why he built it. The love between you and Papa is something special, Mama. It deserves to be remembered. Sarah hugged her son, tears flowing freely now. Thank you, David. Your father would have loved that. I am going to teach Samuel and the other grandkids to carve too, David said. Not initials necessarily, but something meaningful, something that tells their own stories. Papa started a tradition, and I think we should keep it going. Sarah thought about that, about generations of Coopers carving their stories into wood, leaving trails for those they loved. It was a beautiful legacy, one that James would have been proud of. She lived for many more years, surrounded by love and family, watching her grandchildren grow and have children of their own. She told James's story to anyone who would listen, making sure the tale of the cowboy and the fence posts became part of the fabric of Redemption Springs. And when she finally passed, peacefully in her sleep at the age of 83, they buried her beside James under a headstone that read, Sarah Mitchell Cooper. She followed the trail home and she never left. The homestead eventually passed to David, then to his son, and down through the generations. The fence posts were maintained and repaired, and the tradition of carving continued. New stories were added, new initials and messages, but the original SM. Carvings were preserved, treated as historical treasures. They became a landmark, something tourists came to see, the physical proof of a love story that had transcended time. And on quiet evenings, when the wind blew across the Texas prairie and the stars came out, people said you could feel it. The love of James and Sarah Cooper still present in the land, still written in the fences that stretched for miles. It was a love that had been built one post at a time, carved into wood and into history, a testament to patience and persistence, and the belief that true love, once found, never truly ends. The story spread beyond Redemption Springs, became part of Texas folklore. People wrote songs about it, painted pictures, told their children about the cowboy who carved a trail and the woman who followed it. It became a symbol of hope, a reminder that love could overcome any obstacle, any distance, any amount of time. And somewhere, in whatever comes after, James and Sarah Cooper were together again, building new fences in new fields, carving their initials into the fabric of eternity, their love story continuing forever in a place where time had no meaning and separation was impossible. They had found each other once in this life, and they would find each other again in the next, and the next, following trails carved into the stars, forever making their way home to one another.